about the CBI being a cage parrot, can we look at India as being a cage parrot at this point in time? Well, our session, whether India is a high growth or a high dole, what comes first? Now, this session comes at a very, in a very interesting time, because we are looking at an election which is most probably going to be a 2G election. It's going to be fought on growth and governance. And we are also staring at what can technically be described as a season of doles. At this point in time, nearly half of our country is entitled to free water, free electricity, jobs, education, healthcare. But we know on ground, the reality is a lot different. Well, to understand this more and to really figure out whether we should follow a dole or a subsidy-led model of growth, or should we let growth take the lead, we have with us two very eminent economists, two of the best in the world. Can I please invite Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia and Professor Arvind Panagariya on stage, please? Dr. Ahluwalia and Professor Panagariya, let me just say that they both represent very contrarian viewpoints. I'm going to invite Professor Arvind Panagariya first. He is Professor of Economics at Columbia University, a very eminent economist, a thinker. He's authored multiple books, and his most recent being Why Growth Matters, and where he has spoken in detail, written in detail about the Gujarat model of development. So let's hear it from Professor Arvind Panagariya, who is a staunch believer in a growth-led model. Professor Panagariya, please.
Thank you, Shweta. So Montek and I were talking to Shweta back in the green room, and Montek was saying that we're telling Shweta whether she was going to shoot us. And I said, no, Montek, it's just you. My sins compared to yours are minor. But in any case, let me start out. First, very recently, the two books came out, mine with Jagdish Bhagwati and the book by Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen. And I think in the press, Mr. Chidambaram, the finance minister, was asked, what he thought of the two books. And he said, well, Bhagwati and Panagariya have sort of passion for growth, and Drèze and Sen have compassion for the poor. To which actually my reaction was that the minister really perhaps had not read the book carefully. If he had, he would have perhaps said that we have passion for growth because we have compassion for the poor. The point being that ultimately growth is not for its own sake, and certainly at every stage within the Indian development context, as well as much of the academic writing in the development context at least for growth, is growth as an instrument, not as the target. Target is the eradication of poverty, illiteracy, and ill health. That is the context. Now, growth is, nevertheless, having said that, growth is indeed extremely important. And just to give you some fix on this, think of the following. 1950, when we started, our per capita income was about 7,500 rupees at 2004-5 prices. 40 years later, in 1990, the income, per capita income was doubled. It took us 40 years. Today, it's about 6 times the income in 1950. So whatever gain was made, about an increase of about 100% in the first 40 years, about 400% of the gain was made just in the last 20 years. And no surprise that much of the decline in poverty that has happened in India has in fact happened precisely during these last 22 years. Equally dramatically, if I was to think futuristically, in spite of the fact that growth has declined, and I think in part, of course, it is this decline in the growth rate in the last 2 years that has suddenly focused our minds on growth. Because I think, for a long time, those of us who actually advocated growth were derided that, oh, this just doesn't trickle down to the poor. It's only now that the growth has, in fact, fallen down below 5%, suddenly we start believing in growth. And, you saw this derision appearing in this, obsession with growth, obsession with comparisons with China, etc., to deride those of us who advocated growth. But I think that conversation, that narrative has certainly shifted quite a bit now in favor of growth, and everybody now does want growth. But looking futuristically, just think of the following. If India could continue to grow in dollar terms at the rate at which it has grown in the last decade, over the next 15 years, from about $1.85 trillion today, in 15 years, India will be an $8.5 trillion economy. That will make India very comfortably the third largest economy in the world, well ahead of all the others that it is behind, like France, Germany, UK, but also ahead of Japan. That is the power of compounding, power of growth rates, and of course, that sort of growth would also make poverty, as we know it, history. And as far as the social expenditures are concerned, education, health expenditures, expenditures on infrastructure, one could simply quadruple or quintuple them in 15 years' time from what they are today. And that, of course, also is the story of the past, that compared to what we were able to do in 1950, simply because the income levels are so low, today the educational and health expenditures are easily more than 10 times of what they were in 1950. That is what growth allows you to do. If you were to actually spend in 1950 on education what you spend today, you would be spending on education alone more than 20% of the GDP, a virtual impossibility. So clearly the power of growth, of course, is just enormous. And I think we can get there. I mean, if we do the right things, we would have the election coming in 2 months' time. And there's a lot of reform agenda which has been lying dormant for the last 10 years. And one hopes that, there will be a new government which will be much more reform-oriented and would take up this cause of the reforms. Certainly, I think, there is a set of things India could do. Return very quickly to 8 to 9% growth rate, even accelerated beyond 10%. So the scenario that I outlined, getting there within 15 years, is completely feasible scenario, at least in my view. And that, of course, is much faster than what the finance minister recently put in his budget. He was saying by 2043, India will be the third largest economy. I think that's too late. I would like to see it happen in my lifetime. Now, there are issues of doles versus growth, and certainly, I mean, in the sense of doles as in raising the LPG cylinders from 9 to 12, or, pushing through an ordinance, a food security bill to actually win the elections during these state-level elections. I think that form of doles is, at least its salience in the elections, is becoming more and more passé. And certainly it was tried in my home state, Rajasthan, quite vigorously, and it certainly didn't work. It is the message of growth and development of Vasundhara Raje Scindia that went through the people, and she really won a landslide victory in that election. And I think that we are seeing repeatedly now in a number of different states. I think this is going to play out the same way in the forthcoming national elections as well. There is, I mean, and one has to make a distinction, of course, between social expenditures and the doles. Social expenditures, of course, must rise. But again, there is an issue of architecture of those social expenditures. I have always argued that empower the people, give them the money through cash transfers, through vouchers, etc. Let them decide, just as Arvind Shuri this morning actually talked about. Empower the people, let them decide whether they want to go to the private providers, be it education, health, anything else, or they want to go to the public schools or public health centers, the dispensaries, etc. Overwhelmingly, in fact, people are voting in favor of the private providers, even in rural areas. Arvind mentioned in education, but in health, if you go to the rural areas, in spite of 45 to 50 years of building up of these these primary healthcare centers and community healthcare centers, today 80% of the people for outpatient care go to the private provider. About 55% go even for inpatient care, in-hospital care, to the private sector, even in the rural areas in today. So clearly, people want to go to the private sector, and I think those are the ones should be empowered. Finally, since Montek is here, he is the plan man, and I cannot resist raising the issue of planning. I think planning has become our habit. For the last 60 years, we are doing it, so we continue to do it. But I think it's time, actually, we should break that habit. We are now in a market economy. There is, this distinction of planned versus unplanned. Why should anything be unplanned in any case? But certainly, it has to be planned, but not by the Planning Commission. It has to be planned by the government, the ministries, etc. So I certainly, lean that way. Even China today really has done it for many years. Calls what used to be the National Planning Commission now is called actually National Reforms Commission. And I think we have to think that as well. So I certainly, as my last point, would say that I think time has perhaps come that we rethink the institutions. I think for 1960, when 1950s these institutions were created, they had a certain logic to it. But times have changed, and it is time that we rethink at least some of the main institutions. Thank you, Shraddha.
Thank you very much, Professor. That was very insightful as always. Can I now please invite Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission. Dr. Ahluwalia needs little introduction. In fact, he has been at the helm of planning growth for India for 10 years now. He's been working. He was one of the chief architects of reforms with Dr. Manmohan Singh. And of course, he was the youngest division chief at the World Bank at the age of 28. Dr. Ahluwalia.
Thank you, Shweta. I'm a little concerned that I was introduced as having a contrarian view. This gives me the impression that there's some script that I'm supposed to speak from, and I think that's not fair. The subject here is growth versus dole. It seems to be, and I think Arvind has spoken quite eloquently about the importance of growth, and I have to disappoint the organizers that I'm not any less enthusiastic about growth. Actually, most of the times, I'm not accused of being anti-growth. I'm being accused of being too pro-growth. So let's be very clear about it. The government of India, certainly the Planning Commission, and I think all the parties that are in the government do not take the view that growth is not important, let's do doles. In fact, the whole strategy that is outlined in the plan is an inclusive growth strategy with very high targets. We're not there at the moment, and the whole effort is that we should get back to it, and I think we can. I think the confusion seems to arise because we use the term inclusive growth, and many people think that we just want to give doles and we don't care about growth. This is just wrong. I think the role of growth has been very clearly spelled out in our official documents by the Prime Minister, by the Finance Minister, and other political leaders. First point we must emphasize is that when we say we want inclusive growth, high inclusive growth, as far as the levels are concerned, we're talking about 8%. I agree with what Arvind just said, that in the last 10 years, we have delivered higher growth than in any 10-year period of India's history. He said that, I agree with him. It's also true that in the last 2 years it has slowed down. That is a matter of concern, but it'd be totally wrong to think that we don't care about the slowdown because we are interested in doles. We are very concerned. We know why it's there. We think it can be brought right. But I do want to emphasize that we are interested also in the nature of growth. See, one approach to the role of growth is high growth gives you revenues. Revenues are then spent on pro-poor programs, and that's why you want high growth. This is not actually correct. We want an inclusive growth where the nature of the growth is going to be inherently more inclusive. That means the growth, there should be high growth in agriculture, because that's where 50% of the population derive their living. And actually that percentage is going down, which is a great sign of success, and should go down further. But we do need higher growth in agriculture. The same GDP growth with a lower growth in agriculture is not as inclusive as a GDP growth with a higher growth in agriculture. That's point number one. Point number two is that the regional dispersion of growth must be good. The same growth rate for the country as a whole, but the poorer states growing too slowly is not good enough. And I think one of the important successes of the 11th plan and what's going on now is that what used to be called the Bimaru states are now growing quite rapidly. Actually, Bihar, which is perhaps the poorest, is actually growing the fastest. So that's an indication of the kind of growth we want and why we think it is important. Equally important is that it must be a growth that is employment generating. And that, in our view, boils down to a growth which is produces a much better result in the manufacturing sector. Again, in the last 2 years, that has not happened. So we must separate out the fact that we are currently facing a problem of a growth slowdown and an especially bad manufacturing performance, identify why it's happening, correct it. We're not saying none of this matters and let's just give doles. So I think any positing that growth versus doles represents economists versus the government of India is simply wrong. Now, one issue that comes up, have we delivered on the inclusiveness? I would say that clearly I mentioned agriculture is doing better than it has ever done before. I mentioned that regional growth rates have improved. That's very important. I think Arvind himself mentioned that as a result of this growth process, we've for the first time seen a sharp reduction in the percentage of the population below the poverty line. And it's not just the percentage that's gone down. The decline for the first time has been sharp enough that the numbers have gone down. I mean, earlier, the percentage used to go down, but because population would expand, the absolute numbers would actually increase. Between 2004 and 2011, for the first time ever, we've had 140 million people who were earlier below the poverty line now moved above it. Mind you, the poverty line is low, and we are, in fact, we've set up an expert group to look at that. But even if you have a higher poverty line, this point that I'm making would remain valid. So what is really the role of doles? I think we need to separate out doles that are pure transfer payments. I mean, for example, Social Security for the aged. It's a simple, straight transfer payment to support people at a very vulnerable stage in their lives. You know, all democratic countries that run market economies have an element of a social security system. Ours is actually just beginning. That's a clear dole. Then you have programs that relate to health, education. It's wrong to call them doles. These are investments in the delivery of services. I think Arvind made a very important point that you have to ask the question, should this be delivered through public sector or through the private sector? Actually, the government of India is quite willing to see an element of participation by the private sector in the delivery of these services. I mean, we have programs in the case of schools which encourage private schools to come in, and they can charge fees for some percentage and take people at free for a certain other percentage. Similar programs for private-public partnership exist in the health sector. The Rashtriya Swasth Bima Yojana, which is a health insurance scheme for the poor, I mean, essentially allows any health service provider whether public or private, to register under the scheme. The person registers to get the insurance. The government of India subsidizes 75% of the premium. State government pays 25%, and the guy can go to whichever hospital he wants. So the fundamental point that I think Arvind was making is you must ask yourself, should you be doing health and education? I think he agrees we should be doing health and education. Should you only do it through the public sector? The system is actually open. It's created flexibilities that allow the private sector to come in. So I don't think there's a difference of opinion there. Sometimes you have programs like the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. I know that in business circles, and I guess, I don't know if India today, Conclave wants to call itself business circles, but I mean, you have quite a lot of business people participating. There's a tendency to think of this as just a dole. And it may well be, by the way, that many of the people who are in favor of these schemes think of them as a kind of disguised unemployment insurance program. But actually, it is meant to be employing people at very low rates in order to produce productive assets in rural areas, with a very clear priority that those productive assets should, as far as possible, be aimed at tackling the water scarcity problem. And anybody who knows anything about agriculture will tell you that tackling the water scarcity problem in agriculture is the single most important thing the government can do. Now, there are many problems with the scheme. There are leakages, it could be run better, but you know, that is true of any government program. I just feel that I find too often, when you ask people, what is it that you think is a dole, they come up with the reference to the employment program. Frankly, I think properly managed, the employment program can be a method of funding useful rural infrastructure. You know, the other area in which we talk about dole, you could call it a dole, is pure subsidy. And frankly, our view in the Planning Commission is that that is an area of clear weakness. In the 12th plan, we had quite categorically said that if you want to invest in the core sectors of the economy, health, education, and infrastructure is very crucial for the revival of growth. One of the things you have to do is to bring subsidies down. We didn't, by the way, say abolish subsidies. I would say that, you know, subsidies aimed at food might have the top priority. But subsidies for energy really are not functionally contributing to creating a strong, and I'm sure that Arvind agrees with this too. So, I mean, we're disappointing you, Shweta, unless he wants to disagree with me on that. That's a different issue. But, you know, this is a very difficult issue. I think where you could say is government has not been able to do what it wanted to do on energy subsidies. Well, my response would be that we deregulated petrol, we've started a process of adjustment in diesel, but let's face it, this is an election year. And in no democracy is an election year the year where all sensible policies get taken. There are many things that, you know, you make a commitment and then it gets done over time. So frankly, I feel that the strategy of the government is not one of ignore the growth and go for doles. That's totally wrong. It is very strongly that we must have growth, much higher growth than we have now, even higher than in the last 10 years. But it must be a particular kind of growth, regional balance, agriculture, employment generating. And if there's difference of view on that, let's bring that out. At the same time, these programs of health and education, they're not doles. They are providing a basic access to services which you need. And frankly, they actually feed back into growth. You need an educated, skilled population if you're going to sustain a high growth rate. And one of the interesting things we are doing in the 12th plan is we're shifting the focus a little from too much formal education into much more skill development. In my view, that needs to be expanded greatly. But I think a very important start has been made. So these should not be viewed as doles. True, they provide a certain amount of access to services, but they feed back. A healthier, more literate, more educated, skilled population is what will make it possible for India to grow at 8%. That's the strategy that the government is following. And I don't want to go on this, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahluwalia, for clarifying UPA's strategy and thought on dole versus growth. However, I'd like to make one small point here, and I am quoting our Prime Minister, who said that we need growth to be able to fund all the subsidy programs and welfare programs that the government has. Now, in 2005, we had Narega was allocated 11,000 crore rupees. At that time, growth was at 9.5%. In 2012-13, Narega has been allocated 33,000 crore rupees when India grew at 5%. So what's the correlation here? Because clearly we see that growth has not kept pace. As in, we have not grown at a pace that we are able to afford these subsidy programs, and I'm not even going into the other subsidy programs, and that's dented India's image. I mean, we've been threatened to be downgraded to junk status. So it's invited a whole host of criticism. India's stand on subsidies. What would be your take on that?
Well, you quoted the Prime Minister, but I can give you lots of quotes of the Prime Minister which endorse exactly what I've said. So he's very much in favor of growth. He's very much in favor of inclusive growth. But you would agree with
what the Prime Minister said. You need growth to be able to fund the programs, right?
No, but that's absolutely true. I mean, everybody would agree that the resource flow that you can generate is a function of growth. And quite honestly, if you don't have the growth, you will have to cut down many of your programs. Which one is a matter of prioritization? But I think the important point is, you made 2 points. One is you seem to give the impression that the Prime Minister doesn't agree with me when I say growth is important.
I'm not trying to make it. No, that's not my intention.
He's in favor of that, and I agree with him. So let's be clear on that point. On the second issue, that when growth goes down, should you cut these programs? That's a relevant issue. See, in my view, the slowing down of growth that we have experienced is not due to less expenditure. It is due to some new constraints that have emerged, which need to be tackled. We've taken some steps to tackle them, and these are really a number of regulatory constraints that have hit the progress and implementation of large infrastructure projects. I must mention to you, by the way, that one view would be that why aren't you able to fix it? The problem is that in a democratic environment, when you're talking about regulatory clearances, there are many people who feel that you shouldn't do a shortcut on these regulatory clearances, so one needs to do a bit of a consensus building. I think the government's done that. They set up the Cabinet Committee on Investment. They also set up a project monitoring group in the Cabinet Secretariat. And merely by discussion, they've brought about a somewhat more positive approach, which has led to many clearances.
You've not answered my question. Is it good economics to increase spends on subsidies when the economy is not growing, when the revenues are not coming?
No.
Where are you getting the money from?
I accept when you say subsidies, you talked about Narega. I think when growth is down and resources are cut, it's energy subsidies that should be cut, quite clearly. I mean, let's prioritize.
Why not fertilizer? Fertilizer
Yeah,
subsidies.
I agree with you. But, let me put it this way. I don't believe there's a single economist who's had a job in the government of India for the last 20 years who hasn't said that. So first point is, I agree with it, but I cannot claim originality. That is just an incredibly difficult thing. Also, by the way, there's not a single political party that's willing to support it either. So I'm afraid fertilizer subsidy, and this is true in all democracies, subsidies to agriculture completely escape any economic rationale. That's true of the United States, it's true of Europe, it's true of all the emerging market countries. I agree with you that both the subsidy of free power to agriculture, which is not a central government decision, it's a state government decision, and the subsidy on fertilizer, and we've said this many times, they're dysfunctional. But whether we can do anything about it, well, that's a practical issue.
Okay, Professor Panagariya wants to say something.
Let me say this, Montek. Politicians, of course, try to obfuscate the differences to get an agreement academics do exactly the opposite. They sharpen the differences to improve the understanding. To me, it seems you have obfuscated actually the differences precisely in the way that Amartya Sen does, which is, well, you also believe in growth, and towards the end, as you got in, you said, Arvind will also agree with this, presuming that I agreed with everything else that you had said before. but look, the big difference here is that saying that you believe in growth is not enough. What have you done? What have we done in the last 10 years to do the growth? I mean, we just haven't done it. It is.
Let me ask you.
It is in the same spirit. Let me just complete just two more things. You said also about, as if on education and health also we agreed. But, just allowing private sector to operate, giving them the rights to operate, is not equivalent to actually facilitating, being an enabler for the private sector to operate successfully. I mean, you've got to give the power to the people. Why is it that there has been no effort to give vouchers to the students? Let the poor, I mean, even the teachers of the government schools, because they are paid well enough, send their own children to the private schools. Why not give the bottom? Just last thing I would say, because I'm just trying to put in two or three of the things that you said. I want to want to bring out my differences with you. And the third, of course, is that, on petrol subsidy, you say that, oh, this is derailed, but NDA had actually done that deregulation when the NDA went out in 2004. It was reversed at that time. 10 years later, we are now trying to struggle back with the petrol subsidy and then going on to diesel. I think there's a lot this government has to account for.
Let's go a little bit in the reverse order. It's true that the NDA government had announced the deregulation, and that was when crude oil prices were $20 to the barrel. As they started to rise, they failed to actually implement. When the UPA government came in, the problems with implementing it was that people said, look, the previous government didn't implement it, so why do you want to push this now? Of course, nobody knew that oil prices are going to keep on rising. So even today, across political parties, this would be a great contribution you can make, by the way, if you can get whichever political party either you're talking to or is listening to you, and I would say all of them, get them to make a commitment that yes, energy prices should be aligned with world prices. It would be a terrific idea. Now, coming back, you got a lot of applause for saying, what have we done in the last 10 years to get growth? But you're the one who said in the last 10 years we've had the highest growth ever. Now, are you going to say this is nothing?
I didn't say that thanks to you.
So what you're saying... No, but look, this is the very...
Narasimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And that I have written in a number of places.
I know, but...
You tell me 5 policy measures that you took to make this happen.
In my view, you should not be allowed to get away with a proposition that says that the entire performance of 10 years, I'm not talking 1 year, the entire performance of 10 years is due to the previous 20. No. It just doesn't make any sense.
But your contribution, the UPA contribution, certainly is that it did not tamper with the reforms. That had
they did a lot more also.
But what?
Well, I mean, that's now a new subject, which I don't know if they have time we can go into. Well, I will tell you. I'll tell you. I'll tell you.
1 minute.
The entire public-private partnership thrust in infrastructure more or less dates from 2004. I know it was talked about earlier.
The NDA, your own affidavit, the government's affidavit to the Supreme Court says that about half of the roads built in the last 20 years were built by the NDA.
No, by the way, let's be clear. About half of the roads built were commissioned in the last year of the end. Yes, you take a look. We can... Look, the key, I think this is an election year, so it's a good thing. I mean, it's nice. Even when I watch television, I don't really want to watch people agreeing with each other. But in case somebody in the audience has an interest in stepping back, I think the key issue is the following. If you compare the last 10 years with the previous any 10 years, the difference is huge. Then people say, oh, UPA 1 did a good job, but UPA 2 didn't. If you compare UPA 2 with NDA, the UPA comes out better, except in one dimension, and that's inflation. And the important reason for that also, the NDA period was a period when global inflation was very low. This is a period when global inflation has been very high. So what is in most people's minds, the focus is on the last year. That's been a bad year. But I think you've got to be clear about it. We do not believe that the current momentum of the economy is a 4% growth momentum. And actually, nobody globally believes it either. All your friends abroad and all the investment analysts and this and that are projecting that in the coming year, India will do much better than it did in the previous year. So frankly, I think to hijack the growth agenda as if it's not a government agenda, the government hasn't delivered, and the government doesn't even want to deliver, is a gross exaggeration. Now, maybe there are some people who you think take that view, but not me.
I'm sorry, Montek, but you know, I mean, take your manufacturing policy. It's great for aspirations, 25% share in the GDP. What are the policy reforms you're willing to do? I mean, this is not a new thing. Labor reform, labor market rigidities have been known. You yourself wrote when you sat in the opposition under NDA.
And factory output has been in the negative for many, many quarters now.
No, look, the task force on employment that you had at Montek, fantastic report. I wrote columns about it. You know, but then you have never said anything in the last 10 years about labor market reform.
No, that's not true, by the way. The official position of the government of India, and repeated actually by the Prime Minister also, is that labor market flexibility is necessary. We've also said that. However, the position is this is a sensitive issue on which we need to build a political consensus. Now,
10 years.
But you haven't got a consensus. It's a real problem.
10 years.
I would urge you,
look, Montek,
this is a time when
I think we can take this conversation
This is a time when
offline.
manifestos are being drafted. Independent economists should try to inject into manifestos a clear commitment for labor reform. It would be a great contribution.
Very quickly, Dr. Ahluwalia, you said Congress's agenda is of inclusive growth. How would you see BJP and AAP's economic agenda? Very, very quickly.
How do you see what?
BJP and AAP's economic agenda, considering you said Congress's is inclusive growth. How would you identify?
Well, I haven't read the BJP's manifesto. I don't think they put it out, and I don't know what I mean, it's odd to ask me. I don't think either the BJP or AAP would like me pronouncing on their agenda.
I wanted your opinion
and
on
I haven't seen the Congress, I think, is about to put out its agenda. I can tell you about policy as it stands now. I've said that, and I would hope that whatever government comes to power follows most, if not all, of what I've said. And I think there will be one or two areas which may be sensitive, but I think if the new government takes the broad thrust that I'm talking about, I think we're all right. One thing I'm very concerned about, I don't think you should encourage a notion that include elements of growth that either make growth inclusive or elements which actually directly go to help the poor are somehow bad. Now, where I think Arvind said something very important, why not encourage the private sector to come in? I'm in favor of that. And I gave examples, by the way. Rashtriya Swasth Bima Yojana is an outright example. And people are doing a wonderful job. In the primary schools, we've just started a new model school system. We're inviting the private sector to come in.
Okay, so
we should do more of that. I agree with that.
Okay, so I think it was a non-conclusive discussion, but I don't think we can drive consensus on this. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a pleasure. And, like I started out saying, two contrarian viewpoints here. It'll be interesting to see what the new finance minister does, considering what Mr. Chidambaram leaves behind is just 30% of tax revenues to be spent on development work. Rest will go into subsidies. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta. Thank you, gentlemen. I would request both Mr. Panagariya and Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia to remain on stage as I call upon our session sponsor, Petronet, Dr. A.K. Balyan, MD and CEO, Petronet LNG Limited. Request him to please come up on stage and present a token of our appreciation to the gentleman here. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please have a round of applause